Love Story by Gary K. Wolfe. This is the first published story from the author who is perhaps best known as the creator of Roger Rabbit. It was originally published in the December 1970 issue of Worlds of Tomorrow magazine, republished in a collection of the author's stories called The Road to Toontown in 2020. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Love Story. Soon it will be over. They start to walk. Heads turn, row by row, to watch them as they move down the aisle. In the chapel balcony, an organ plays the wedding processional. For them, only for them. Their favorite colors project from tiny lights in the chapel dome. Their favorite fragrances puff from vents hidden behind chapel statuary. Straight ahead of them, in front of the altar, a priest waits with open arms. As they stop in front of him, the synthesizer ends the organ music with an intricate flurry of chords. The age-old ritual begins. The priest blesses them, walks to his pulpit, and delivers a sermon on the sanctity of marriage. Finishing, he asks them to meditate. As they kneel and drop their eyes, he moves toward the altar. He flips a switch. A cone of silence energizes around them, leaving them in isolation, heads bowed, to ponder their future, and to bask in the warmly sweet remembrances of their past. Even though he was born 7 years before her, they still had a great deal in common, even from the very start when they had been carried 7 years apart to the maternity ward's analytical laboratory to be examined for birth defects. From instrument to instrument they went. Magnetic resonance for cell conformity, passed. X-ray crystallography for bone composition, passed. Electrophoresis for hemoglobin and isoenzyme analysis, passed. For hours they passed test after test with ridiculous ease. But that was only normal. No newborn had failed to pass a test in almost 5 centuries. 7 years separated them, but like all infants, each in turn was subjected to the inviolate routine. When the laboratory had finished with them, they were taken to the hospital nursery and placed under the watchful care of a mechanical nursemaid. By her, they were cuddled and suckled, tickled and rocked. So effective was this nursemaid that both of them retained as their first cogent memory the lyrical cooing that issued from the speaker deep in her breast. That and the comforting throb of her vacuum pump heart. After weaning came the child care center. For both of them, their center years were happy and wonderful. A rearing staff of mechanicals and humans made sure they were never lonely or hungry, never without someone to play with them, laugh with them, and kiss away their tears when they cried. As they grew older, a rearer was always on hand to listen to them, talk to them, and answer their questions. All they had to do was ask, and a rearer would patiently explain to them why things fall down, how trees grow, where the rain comes from, and why the sky is blue. Even when their questions became less childish, more probingly curious, less concerned with trees and rain and sky, more with birth and death and love, answers came every bit as promptly and were every bit as truthful. Nothing was ever kept from them. In response to their queries on self-origin, they were shown a carefully detailed, transparent, life-size model of a pregnant woman. When they seemed to have absorbed this bit of historical background, they were taken to see the latest model of Wombette. As they stood before it, with an audio tape machine hanging from their belts and tiny earphones covering their ears, the soothing voice of a genetic physician thoroughly explained conception. Their attention was directed to the small, partially developed child still encased in the wombet's hygienically gellular interior. Comparisons were drawn between this developmental method and the more primitive natural method they had seen demonstrated earlier in the transparent model. After describing the complex series of conformational tests each fetus had to pass before birth, the tape machine automatically shut off. The lecture was followed by a tour of the nursery. During question and answer time, they asked their computer tutor to clarify why children were no longer conceived naturally. They were instructed to go to the video room where a pre-recorded program would explain in greater detail. They watched the video screen intently. The first scene showed a square plot of land with 3 people on it. This, a narrator told them, represented the average number of people per square mile of land in the year shown in the corner of the screen. Years began ticking off. More and more people appeared on the plot. Finally, when people stood shoulder to shoulder, covering all but a tiny portion of the plot's area, the ticking years stopped abruptly at a date 5 centuries in the past, and the scene froze. On this date, the narrator declared, the World Council had halted population growth by requiring that specific conditions be met before new children were brought into the world. A swift series of scene changes revealed what these conditions were. The show was over. For the first time in their lives, they were afraid. With the story of conception and childbirth fresh in their minds, they asked to be told of their parents. They were brought to a sensory input room, put into a reclining chair, tranced, and connected to the imputer. Were it not for my parents, their minds began telling them, I would not be alive today. I must respect and honor my parents always. They were the first to love me. The sensory imputer then recycled and delivered the same message again. After it had done so 1,000 times, it raised them from their trance and told them they could go. They left the sensory input room feeling closer to their parents than they ever had before. Soon after, they asked about death. That night, a gentle voice whispered to them while they slept. The voice assured them that medical technology could keep their life processes functioning perfectly forever. They would probably never have to contend with death. They need never die. They awoke refreshed. As they grew older, they continued to play, to be happy, and to learn. They were lectured on demography, automation, contraception, hydroponics, binary summation, and all the other subjects they needed to master to survive. On their 18th birthday, they left center, moved into living complexes with others in their own age groups, and began work in the professions they had been taught. Life became a series of short relationships and casual liaisons. They found pleasure but not contentment, fun but not meaning, until the day they met and fell in love. Never had either found another so gentle, so kind and giving. They took out an automatic dissolution bond and moved into a living complex together. When it expired, they took out another, then another, and another still. Eventually, as years passed and their affection grew, they took out a mutual consent dissolution bond and promised each other to honor it forever. Looking back on those days, they were never able to pinpoint exactly what first got them thinking about it. Perhaps they matured. Perhaps they grew melancholy. Maybe they just felt unfulfilled. No matter. After discussing it for quite some time, in the end, they made up their minds. They decided to submit a request to have children. One morning, they transported to a forms office where they were given 2 blank forms to fill out. They went to one of the office's tables, sat down, and began to write. For almost half a day, they labored over Form 1, Request for Permission to Have Children, until they had completed all the questions to their satisfaction. They gave up the completed form to the office's data acquisition system, which transposed it through a series of photoelectric processes into a digital entity it could understand. It flashed a green light to indicate all was in order, then flashed another signal to show it was ready to process the forms of the next person in line. They went back to the table to tackle the problems posed by Form 2, Long-Range Guidance Plan for Character Development in Children. In an introductory paragraph, the form reminded them that if their requests were granted and if they went on to meet all the conditions, they would be allowed to conceive one boy and one girl genetically controlled within close tolerances to ensure the uniformity necessary for peace and contentment on an overcrowded world. They were told to carry out that portion of child-rearing responsibility left to them, selecting the specific personality refinements their children would acquire at guidance classes in center. All the options were clearly spelled out on the form before them. Motivations and beliefs. Within applicable limits, please specify. Temperament. Choose one. Refined, good-natured, passive. Specific personality characteristics. Check all that apply. Gentle, giving, kind. They took the completed form back to the data acquisition system where it was hastily scanned, collated, and accepted. Then they went home to wait. Weeks went by and they heard nothing. They began to worry. After all, facilities for child rearing were so limited and so expensive. Many were refused. Maybe something in their background prohibited their having children. Perhaps their guidance plan had been too offbeat, too radical. At last, they received an answer. They read the message together as it appeared on their home view screen. This is to inform you that your request to have children has been acted upon favorably. Period. Once you have fulfilled the required conditions, your children will be born. Period. Written confirmation will follow. Period. Congratulations. End. They looked at each other, smiled, and embraced, fortifying themselves for the ordeal to come. They liquidated all their belongings. Using the proceeds and their entire life savings, they created a trust fund to handle the costs of education. Once this had been done, they were permitted to go to the clinic for genetic selection and begin creation of their children. At the clinic, they were probed and tested. Their characteristics were electronically recorded, genetically segmented, studied, and refined. 2 perfect eggs and 2 perfect sperm were ultimately selected and combined to form 2 perfect zygotes. Their future offspring were then placed into a womette. Here, their babies would grow, being tested all the while for adherence to standard. Minor deviations could be corrected easily enough by embryonic reinforcement, a delicate interplay of motion, temperature, and light. Gross deviations would be cause for termination and would require selection of another egg and another sperm. In either event, passing or failing, there was nothing for them to do now but wait. 9 months later, they were told. Genetic physicians confirmed that their children had passed all prenatal tests. Once born, the children would meet all cultural specifications. Thus, with no further gene selection required of them, and with enough assets in trust to assure their children's futures, they were almost finished. Only the hardest condition remained, the condition that they marry. Now is their moment. They raise their heads and gaze at the priest as he disengages the cone of silence. He comes forward toward them and holds out his hand. Still kneeling, each takes what he offers, a small wafer, a symbol of love. They eat. Rising, they turn to each other and cling ever so tightly together. For less than a moment, they feel each other breathing. Then, as the wafer's poison paralyzes their nervous systems, they die in each other's arms. And as their deaths create two empty spaces in a teeming world, their children are born to take their places, to follow in their footsteps, to live, never to be lonely, and to love. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.